Everyone informed Caleb Mercer that his family's ranch was naught but embers and phantoms. Yet, upon his aged service dog, Ranger, guiding him towards a secluded box canyon behind the remnants, Caleb discovered something defying all reason. Within the frigid gloom stood a creature long presumed extinct. A wild Mustang, its hooves akin to horns, ensnared by a stony confine. Within the animal's gaze, Caleb perceived more than mere terror. He saw an echo of his own war-ravaged spirit, prompting a decision that would either salvage them both or spell their ruin. Please sustain our efforts by subscribing to the channel to chronicle this extraordinary saga. The heater in the venerable Ford pickup had faltered somewhere near the Idaho border, leaving the cabin to mirror the biting November air that streamed past the windows. Caleb Mercer tightened his grasp on the worn steering wheel, his knuckles stark against the dark plastic. At 65 years of age, his circulation was no longer what it once was, and a persistent ache in his lower back served as a constant reminder of airborne assaults and jarring landings from his military tenure. Beside him, occupying the passenger seat with the stoic composure of a retired general, sat Ranger. The large German shepherd lifted his head, his ears swiveling as the scenery transitioned from open highway to the winding, pine-shaded roots of Shadow Creek Valley. Ranger presented a distinctive figure, his coat a striking melange of wolf gray and white, though time had silvered his muzzle with the frost of advanced years. He was 10 years old, an elder in dog years, and much like his master, he bore the unseen wounds from a life dedicated to service. He released a deep, drawn-out exhale, a sound that resonated through the bench seat and settled his heavy chin onto Caleb's thigh. Caleb reached down, his calloused fingers descending into the thick fur around the dog's neck. He was clad in a brown leather jacket that had seen better decades, its zipper broken midway, revealing a red and navy blue plaid flannel shirt beneath. His jeans were faded to the hue of the winter sky, and his sturdy work boots bore the scuffs of countless miles. He fixed his gaze on the road ahead, his gray eyes narrowing. He was returning home, though the term felt tentative. It was merely a destination, the final point on a map that had run its course. The engine sputtered and coughed as they navigated the crest of the final incline, its sound a mechanical lament against the steep ascent. Below them lay the township, a collection of structures clinging to the valley floor like limpets to a hull. It had undergone little alteration since Caleb's departure 30 years prior. It still presented as small, insular, and unyielding. He guided the truck into the gravel lot of Peggy's general store. The signage above the porch was weathered, its paint peeling in long strips like sunburnt integument. Caleb silenced the engine, and the ensuing quietude was palpable. "Stay here, Ranger," Caleb murmured. The dog offered a slow blink of his amber eyes, conveying silent comprehension, and settled back onto the seat. Caleb disembarked, the frigid mountain air striking his face with the force of a slap. He stretched, his spine emitting audible pops, and ascended the wooden steps. The chime above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt dissonant with his somber mood. The interior carried the scent of dust, desiccated herbs, and floor polish. Behind the counter stood a woman who seemed an integral part of the building's original structure. Peggy adjusted her spectacles, her keen gaze appraising Caleb from his salt and pepper brown hair to his well-worn boots. "Quote 1, she inquired, her tone guarded. "Quote 2. Caleb responded, his voice hoarse from days of silence. He placed a crumpled $10 bill on the counter. Peggy accepted the money, her eyes lingering on his face. She squinted, tilting her head. "Quote 3. Caleb stiffened. He had no desire for this exchange. He wished to avoid disturbing the ashes before even reaching the property. "Quote 4. Peggy huffed, her curiosity unappeased, but her business acumen taking precedence. Quote 5. Caleb retrieved his change and turned to depart, but the door opened before he could reach it. A man stood silhouetted in the entrance, bringing with him the aroma of expensive cologne and cigar smoke. He was a portly individual attired in a pristine shearling coat and a cowboy hat that appeared untouched by the elements. Harlan Crow. Caleb recognized him instantly. 30 years prior, Crow had been the affluent youth who had disparaged Caleb's second-hand attire. Now he resembled a potentate surveying his domain. Crow paused, his eyes widening slightly as he observed Caleb. "Well, I'll be," Crow proclaimed, a slow, predatory grin stretching across his features. "The prodigal son returns. I heard a whisper about a beat-up Ford limping into town. Should have known it was you, Mercer." Caleb attempted to sidestep him, but Crow shifted, obstructing his path. "I own the valley now, Mercer," Crow declared, his voice resonating. "Crowland and Cattle Company. We control everything from the river to the ridge." "Congratulations," Caleb stated, his voice low. "Now get out of my way." Crow chuckled, a dry, unamused sound. "I saw you arrive. That truck looks like it's held together by rust and prayers. You look much the same. Listen, I'm a magnanimous fellow. I'll make you an offer right now for that scrap heap of a ranch you've inherited. It's an eyesore. I require more grazing territory for my steers. I'll give you enough cash to fill your tank and see you into a pleasant, warm nursing home down in Florida." The insult struck its mark with precision. Caleb felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. He clenched his fists at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking tautly. "It is not for sale," Caleb stated, meeting Crow's gaze. Crow stepped closer, encroaching upon Caleb's personal space. "Don't be a simpleton. You've been gone 30 years. You abandoned your parents to perish in that fire, and you left the land to decay. You are broken, Mercer, and so is that land. Neither of you serves a purpose any longer." The mention of his parents struck a chord so profound that Caleb perceived his vision momentarily blur. The shame he had harbored for 3 decades flared, hot and agonizing. But accompanying the shame, something else emerged: pride. A soldier's pride that refused to yield under fire. Caleb stepped forward, his face mere inches from Crow's. His voice dropped to a growl, dangerously quiet. "Step aside, Harlan, or I'll demonstrate precisely how broken I am." Quote. 8. Fine. Quote. 9. Go frolic in the ruins. When you freeze out there tonight, don't come begging to me. I'll acquire the deed from the state once you're gone. Caleb pushed past him, shouldering the door open and stepping out into the chill. He walked briskly to his truck, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He pumped the gas with trembling hands, acutely aware of Crow's eyes observing him from the store window. As he climbed back into the cab, Ranger was alert, his hackles raised, a low growl vibrating in his chest. He sensed his master's distress. "It's all right, buddy. Quote 11, we're leaving." He engaged the gear and accelerated rapidly from the lot, gravel scattering in his wake. He drove at speed, leaving the town and its judgments receding in the rearview mirror. The road to the ranch was overgrown, the asphalt fractured and broken by encroaching roots. Weeds scraped against the undercarriage of the truck, a sound akin to skeletal fingers clawing at the metal. As they rounded the final curve, the homestead came into view. Peggy had been accurate. It was a place of specters. The main residence, once a stately 2-story timber structure where his mother had hung floral baskets and his father had enjoyed his pipe, was gone. It had succumbed to its own weight, a heap of charred timber and decay. Only the grand stone chimney remained upright, a solitary sentinel pointing an accusatory finger at the overcast sky. The barn to the west was dilapidated, its roof sagging precariously. Caleb halted the truck near what had formerly been the front gate. He switched off the engine. The silence of the valley enveloped them, vast and indifferent. He gazed upon the remnants of his life. This was his legacy: ashes and weeds. Crow's words reverberated in his mind. "You are broken, and so is that land." Perhaps he was correct. The sun began its descent behind the peaks, casting elongated violet shadows across the valley. The temperature plummeted rapidly. Caleb knew the truck's heater was ineffectual and that no shelter was available in the collapsed house. Quote, Caleb said softly. He lacked the energy to erect a tent. He cleared the clutter from the bench seat, stowing his duffel bag on the floor. He retrieved an old wool blanket from behind the seat and draped it around his shoulders. Ranger curled up on the seat beside him, pressing his warm, solid presence against Caleb's flank. The dog emitted a heavy sigh, resting his head upon Caleb's lap. Caleb placed his hand on Ranger's head, his fingers tracing the soft fur behind the dog's ears. The cold began to permeate the cab, biting at Caleb's toes and stiffening his aching back. He looked out the window at the silhouette of the chimney against the darkening firmament. He was 65 years old, cold, in pain, and utterly alone in the place that was supposed to be home. Yet, as he closed his eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic respiration of the dog beside him, Caleb Mercer made a silent pledge. He would not sell. He would not grant Harlem Crow the satisfaction. He might be broken, but he was still a soldier, and a soldier held his ground. Rest now, Ranger, he whispered into the darkness. We have work to do tomorrow. Morning arrived, not with a burst of sunlight, but with a slow, creeping gray that seeped through the frosted windows of the Ford truck. The cold had settled deep into the metal of the cab during the night, turning the interior into an icebox. Caleb Mercer woke with a sharp intake of breath, his lungs protesting the freezing air. His body felt like a rusted machine that had been left out in the rain for too long. Every joint from his neck down to his ankles was locked in a chorus of aches. But the pain in his lower back was the loudest, a dull, throbbing reminder of a parachute landing that had gone wrong in 1982. Beside him, Ranger was already awake. The German Shepherd sat upright on the bench seat, his ears pricked forward, staring intensely out the windshield toward the ruins of the ranch. He did not look like an old dog in that moment. His posture was rigid, alert, vibrating with a silent urgency. Caleb groaned as he sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. His beard felt rough against his palm. I know, Ranger, Caleb rasped, his voice thick with sleep. It is cold. Let me get the blood moving. Usually, Ranger would wait patiently for Caleb to stretch and find his boots. Today, however, the dog was insistent. He let out a high, thin whine, a sound that cut through the silence of the cab. He pawed at the door handle, his claws clicking urgently against the plastic. This was not the behavior of a dog who simply needed to relieve himself. This was a signal. Ranger had found something, or sensed something that required immediate attention. Caleb frowned. His instincts sharpening despite his exhaustion, he shoved his feet into his heavy work boots, lacing them with stiff fingers. He pulled his brown leather jacket tighter around his chest, ensuring the zipper was pulled up as far as it would go over his red and navy plaid flannel shirt. He grabbed his gloves from the dashboard and opened the driver's side door. The air outside was crisp enough to freeze the moisture in his nose. Ranger leaped from the truck with surprising agility for his age, landing on the frost-covered ground without a sound. He did not stop to sniff the tires or mark his territory. Instead, he trotted a few yards toward the remains of the stone barn, then stopped and looked back at Caleb. His tail gave a single commanded sweep to the left. "Lead on," Caleb muttered, grabbing his walking stick from the truck bed. They moved past the blackened skeleton of the main house. Caleb tried not to look at the charred timbers. There were too many memories buried in that ash, and he was not ready to dig them up yet. He focused on Ranger's gray and white coat moving through the tall, dead grass. The terrain grew rougher as they passed the barn. The ground here was uneven, littered with rocks and hidden gopher holes that threatened to twist an ankle with every step. Caleb hissed through his teeth as his bad knee protested the incline. The cold seeped through his denim jeans, biting at the scar tissue. He wanted to stop, to turn back to the truck in the thermos of coffee he could brew on his portable stove, but Ranger would not allow it. The dog moved with a singular purpose, navigating a narrow deer trail that wound around a massive outcropping of granite. This path led to the Box Canyon, a natural cul-de-sac formed by steep rock walls at the rear of the property. Caleb remembered playing there as a boy, pretending the towering cliffs were the walls of a fortress. It had been a place of safety then. Now, in the pale light of dawn, it looked shadowy and foreboding. As they rounded the final bend of rock, the wind died down, cut off by the canyon walls. The silence here was profound, heavy. Ranger stopped abruptly, his body lowering into a crouch. He did not growl, but his hackles rose in a ridge of fur along his spine. Caleb moved up beside him, his hand resting on the dog's head to signal him to stay. He squinted into the shadows of the canyon. At the far end, a massive slide of shale and earth had come down, likely during the heavy rains of the previous spring. It had blocked off what used to be a secondary exit, turning the canyon into an inescapable prison. And there, standing motionless in the corner where the rock wall met the landslide, was a shape. It looked like a ghost made of bone and matted hair. It was a horse, a Mustang by the look of the broad forehead and sturdy bone structure, but it was a shadow of what a horse should be. Its coat was a dull, muddy bay, caked with filth and burrs. The animal was so emaciated that Caleb could count every rib from 20 yards away. Its hip bones jutted out like sharp angles of geometry under the skin, and its neck was thin and weak. But it was the horse's feet that made Caleb's stomach turn. Quote, Caleb breathed, the words escaping him like a prayer. The hooves were long, horribly long. Neglect had allowed them to grow unchecked for months, perhaps a year. The toes had curled upward and backward, twisting like the shoes of an elf in a grim fairy tale. The horse was forced to rock back on its heels to stand, its tendons strained to the breaking point. Every shift of weight must have been agony. It was a condition that turned a creature of speed and grace into a prisoner of its own body. Ranger let out a soft exhale, looking up at Caleb as if to say, Quote 1. Caleb took a slow step forward. The horse threw its head up, its ears pinning back flat against its skull. It tried to scramble away, but its crippled feet betrayed it. It stumbled, nearly falling to its knees, a grunt of pain escaping its lips. It scrambled for footing, its hooves clattering clumsily against the loose stone. Quote 2. Caleb said, his voice dropping to the low, soothing rumble he used to calm rookie soldiers during a mortar attack. Quote 3. He stopped moving, letting the animal assess him. The horse was trapped. The landslide had cut off its escape, and its feet had prevented it from climbing out. It had eaten every scrap of grass and bark within reach. It was starving to death in a cage of stone. Caleb looked at the horse's face. Despite the starvation, despite the crippling deformity of its hooves, the animal's eyes burned. They were dark, large, and filled with a terrifying mixture of fear and defiance. It reminded Caleb of 1971. He remembered the face of a young private in his platoon, a boy from Arkansas who had been pinned down by enemy fire, bleeding and out of ammunition, yet still holding his empty rifle like a club, refusing to surrender. It was the look of a warrior who knows the end is coming, but refuses to lower his head. Pride mixed with desperation. Quote 4. Caleb whispered. Quote 5. The name came to him then, unbidden, but perfect. Phoenix. The horse watched him, trembling, its breath puffing in white clouds in the frigid air. It did not trust him. Why would it? Humans had likely forgotten it, or worse, chased it into this trap. Caleb felt a heavy weight settle onto his shoulders, heavier than his rucksack ever was. He looked down at Ranger, who was watching the horse with a calm, non-threatening gaze. Quote 6. Caleb said quietly. He thought of Heron Crow. He thought of the slick, expensive coat and the sneer on the man's face. If Caleb sold the land, Crow's men would come up here to survey the property lines. They would find this canyon. They would see a starving, crippled horse with hooves that looked like curled horns. Crow was a businessman. He dealt in assets and liabilities. A horse like Phoenix required thousands of dollars in veterinary care, specialized farrier work, and months of rehabilitation. To a man like Crow, Phoenix was not a living soul. He was vermin. He was a liability. Crow would not spend a dime. He would spend a single bullet. Caleb looked back at the horse. Phoenix shifted his weight again, trying to find a position that did not send fire up his legs. He watched Caleb with that intense, burning gaze, asking a silent question. Caleb Mercer had spent the last 30 years running away. He had run from the memory of the fire. He had run from the guilt of not being there to save his parents. He had run from the emptiness of civilian life. He had come here to sell the last piece of his past and run one last time, to fade away into a warm retirement home where he would not have to think or feel. But he could not run from this. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, shaking slightly from the cold, but they were still strong. He looked at Ranger, his loyal second in command. Then he looked at Phoenix, the broken spirit of the Mercer ranch, waiting to die in the snow. Caleb let out a long, ragged breath that turned to steam. "We are not going anywhere, Ranger," Caleb said, his voice firming up, the rasp disappearing. He turned his back on the horse, moving slowly so as not to startle him, and began the painful hike back out of the canyon. He needed water. He needed hay. He needed tools. He was not a rancher. He was an old, broken-down soldier with a bad back and a truck that barely ran. But as he walked past the stone barn, Caleb Mercer felt a spark in his chest that he had not felt in years. It was not happiness. It was something far more dangerous. It was a mission. Caleb Mercer stood by the tailgate of his truck, staring down the long, overgrown driveway that led back to the main road. The sensible part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 2 tours of duty and 30 years of drifting, told him to leave. He should get in the truck, turn the heater on high, and drive until the Shadow Creek Valley was nothing but a memory in the rearview mirror. He was 65 years old. His back ached, his knees were protesting, and his bank account had dwindled to almost nothing. Attempting to rescue a severely injured horse during a harsh Montana winter was less of a plan and more of a death wish. Yet Heron Crow's voice, laced with disdain, echoed in his thoughts. Quote, Caleb clenched his jaw so tightly his teeth ached. He examined his hands, marred by scars and weather-beaten, trembling slightly from the frigid air. Though these hands were aged, they were not broken, and neither was he. His decision to stay wasn't rooted in a belief in miracles or a heart overflowing with optimism. It stemmed from Harlan Crow's desire for him to leave. It was sheer defiance, a cold, unforgiving anger that settled like a stone in his gut. If Crow wanted this land, he would have to forcibly remove Caleb from it. Quote, Caleb stated, his voice devoid of emotion and sharp as flint. Ranger, nestled in a sliver of weak sunlight near the truck's tire, lifted his head and emitted a low grunt of acknowledgement. His tail remained still. He simply accepted the directive and awaited further instruction. Caleb turned back to the dilapidated homestead. His priority was securing supplies. He navigated towards the buckled barn, proceeding with caution over the decaying timbers. His scavenging was methodical, akin to a combat engineer's, focusing not on the current state of items, but on their potential for repurposing. He unearthed a substantial iron axle from an antiquated tractor, heavily rusted but structurally sound. He also discovered a length of robust hemp rope that had miraculously escaped the ravages of vermin. Several solid oak planks, once part of stalled doors, were also retrieved. Equipped with his salvaged provisions, he and Ranger commenced the unhurried journey back to the Box Canyon. Phoenix, the horse, was precisely where they had left him, standing near the rock face with his head bowed low. Upon spotting Caleb, the animal tensed, gingerly shifting its weight on its improperly formed hooves. It was parched. The dry, frothy saliva clinging to the corners of its mouth indicated its thirst. A natural spring was located at the rear of the canyon, but a recent landslide had blocked it with a colossal boulder and a considerable amount of shale. Caleb set down his findings and surveyed the predicament. The boulder impeding the water source likely weighed no less than 400 pounds. In his 20s, Caleb might have impulsively attempted to shove it aside. Now he understood the futility of such an endeavor. His body was like a machine with worn components. Forcing it would lead to irreparable damage. He needed to employ strategy over brute strength. He approached the jumble of rocks. Phoenix observed him with weary eyes, snorting softly as Caleb drew near the obstruction. "Easy now, Phoenix," Caleb murmured. "I'm just the repair crew." Caleb strategically positioned one of the oak planks beneath the boulder's edge, creating a stable base. He then slid the iron axle under the rock, resting it against the plank, effectively constructing a fulcrum. This was fundamental physics, the kind of knowledge that had facilitated minefield clearance and bridge construction in 1971. The principle was simple. Provide a man with a sufficiently long lever, and he could move the world. He secured the rope to the far end of the axle, extending his leverage. The opposite end he wrapped around his gloved hands, taking a deep breath. Ranger did not intervene. A younger canine might have balked at the rock or attempted to excavate the shale, thereby expending valuable energy. Ranger, however, possessed greater discernment. He had established a perimeter at the canyon's entrance, resting flat on his belly with his forepaws crossed. His amber eyes meticulously scanned the ridgeline, vigilant for any sign of a mountain lion or other peril. He was conserving his energy, reserving it for moments of critical necessity. Like Caleb, Ranger was a seasoned operative, understanding that in protracted engagements, energy was the most precious resource. Periodically, Ranger would issue a low, sharp bark to indicate a hawk circling too close or a subtle shift in the wind. Caleb would acknowledge him with a nod, and they would resume their silent work. They functioned as a cohesive unit of two, operating with a deliberate, unhurried cadence that belied their advanced age. Caleb planted his boots firmly against the loose shale. He took up the slack on the rope. "Here we go," he grunted. He exerted force. The rope dug into his gloves. The muscles in his back protested vehemently, sending a searing line of pain down his spine. He gritted his teeth, suppressing the discomfort. His focus remained on the iron axle and the principles of physics. The boulder emitted a low groan, a deep grating sound of stone against stone. "Come on," Caleb hissed, sweat beading on his forehead despite the frigid air. He leaned back, channeling his entire body weight into the lever. For a tense moment, nothing changed. The rock appeared immobile, an intrinsic part of the mountain. Caleb felt his strength waning, his grip loosening. "You are broken." The memory of Crow's mocking sneer ignited a fresh surge of adrenaline. With a guttural roar of exertion that reverberated off the canyon walls, Caleb delivered one final, desperate heave. The boulder budged. It tipped, rolled, and then plummeted down the shale pile with a heavy, thudding impact that shook the earth. Caleb stumbled backward, gasping for breath, his chest heaving. He released the rope and leaned against the canyon wall, his legs trembling. He felt lightheaded, with black spots dancing at the edges of his vision. Then he heard it. A faint, delicate, musical sound, the trickle of water. From the dark cavity left by the displaced boulder, a steady stream of clear, cold water began to flow, carving a path through the dust and gathering in a small pool among the rocks. Phoenix sensed it immediately. The horse's ears perked forward. He whinnied weakly and shuffled forward, his malformed feet clattering across the stones. Reaching the pool, he plunged his muzzle into the water, drinking in long, noisy gulps. Caleb watched him, a weary smile gracing his lips. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. His back throbbed. His hands were raw, and he was utterly spent. Yet he had achieved a victory in this immediate battle. He had moved the mountain. Ranger trotted over from his guard post, his tail giving a slow, approving wag. He approached the water cautiously, waiting for the horse to finish before taking a drink himself. "We did good, Ranger," Caleb whispered, reaching down to stroke the dog's ears. Quote 1. The sun began its descent below the canyon rim, plunging them back into shadow. The temperature dropped sharply. Caleb recognized that the coming night would be severe. He had secured water, but sustenance and shelter for the horse from the wind remained critical. He looked at Phoenix, who, having finished drinking, now regarded Caleb with a gaze possessing slightly less apprehension than before. The horse exhaled a long sigh, clouds of steam billowing from his nostrils. Quote 2. Caleb conveyed to the horse. Quote 3. He gathered his tools, his movements stiff and deliberate. He was an aging man engaged in a struggle against the elements, against starvation, and against the inexorable passage of time. However, as he departed the canyon with Ranger at his side, Caleb Mercer stood a little taller. His actions were not motivated by hope, but by his unyielding identity as a soldier, one who never abandons his post. The sun had vanished behind the jagged mountain peaks, causing the temperature to plummet with alarming speed. The wind had intensified, howling through the valley like a wounded animal, tearing at the loose shingles of the collapsed barn and whistling through the gaps in Caleb Mercer's aged truck. The Ford's cabin was no longer a suitable refuge. It was essentially a metal box amplifying the cold, and Caleb knew that a night spent on the bench seat would leave him incapacitated by pain by morning, if not succumbing to hypothermia. He stood before the sole structure on the property that still possessed a roof: the root cellar. It was a low, earthen mound reinforced with stone and timber, dug deep into the side of a small hill behind the remnants of the main house. It had survived the fire that destroyed the home 30 years prior, protected by the insulating properties of the earth itself. Quote 4. Caleb stated, his words immediately snatched away by the wind. He pulled the collar of his worn brown leather jacket up around his ears. Beneath it, his red and navy plaid flannel shirt offered minimal warmth. The cold was pervasive. Ranger, sensing the urgency, required no further prompting. The gray and white shepherd waited by the heavy wooden doors of the cellar, his tail tucked against the biting wind. Caleb grasped the iron ring of the cellar door. The hinges had long since rusted solid. He braced his boots against the frozen mud and pulled. The wood protested with a resonant groan, a mournful sound of friction and age, before yielding. The doors swung open, revealing a black, cavernous opening that smelled of damp earth and stale air. He retrieved a battery-powered lantern from his truck and descended the stone steps. The beam of light pierced the gloom, illuminating a space that time had seemingly forgotten. Wooden shelves lined the walls, some still bearing jars of preserves turned black with decay. The floor was composed of dirt, packed hard by generations of Mercer boots. However, it was dry and considerably warmer than the biting air outside. Quote 5. Caleb muttered, directing the light into the corners. Quote 6. For the next hour, Caleb worked with a feverish intensity. He cleared broken jars and the detritus of rodent nests. He transported the old mattress from the truck bed, though it was stiff with cold. He brought in his duffel bag, his small camping stove, and a few blankets. Ranger patrolled the confines of the small room, sniffing each corner, his nose twitching as he cataloged the impressions of the past. As Caleb was clearing a pile of rotted burlap sacks from the far corner, his boot struck something solid. It produced a dull, heavy metallic sound, unlike the hollow thud of wood or the clinking of glass. He frowned and knelt, brushing away the layers of dirt and decay. Beneath the accumulation of dirt resided a rectangular metallic receptacle, coated in olive drab. It was a surplus military ammunition container, the type employed for storing 50 caliber projectiles. It boasted impermeability to water, an airtight seal, and was practically impervious to damage. Caleb identified it without hesitation. This particular container had belonged to his father, Jeremiah Mercer. A slow, heavy cadence, entirely unrelated to physical exertion, began to pound within his chest. He extracted the box from the earth and conveyed it to the room's center, placing it beneath the lantern's illumination. Ranger approached, investigating the metal container with curiosity before settling beside Caleb, his amber gaze observant. Caleb wiped his hands on his worn jeans. He extended his hand and activated the securing mechanism. The metal snapped open with a sharp mechanical sound that resonated within the confined area. He lifted the substantial lid. The rubber gasket had served its purpose effectively. The atmosphere within the box carried a faint aroma of aged paper and pipe tobacco, a scent so recognizable it caused Caleb's chest to constrict. Inside, two objects were present. At the uppermost layer lay a voluminous envelope fashioned from yellowed manila paper. Beneath it rested a leather-bound volume, its cover smoothed by frequent handling. Caleb opened the envelope first. It contained the deed to the ranch. The paper felt crisp, the legal verbiage complex and formal, designating Jeremiah and Abigail Mercer as the legitimate proprietors of the Shadow Creek homestead. This was the document Harlan Crow was so determined to acquire. Caleb set it aside. It was merely paper. He then picked up the book. It was a journal. Caleb's hands trembled as he opened the cover. The penmanship was instantly recognizable. It was his father's script, jagged and assertive, inscribed with a fountain pen that deeply scored the page. He turned to the final few entries. The dates ceased abruptly in the winter of 1995. 30 years ago, November 12th, 1995. Caleb articulated the date aloud, his voice hoarse in the quiet cellar. Abigail is experiencing a decline today. Her cough has become deeply lodged in her chest, and the physician indicates the cold is proving fatal. I attempted to repair the furnace, but the necessary components are prohibitively expensive. We are exhausting our supply of cordwood. The snow has accumulated 4 feet high against the barn's entrance. I am weary. I am exceedingly weary. Caleb cleared his throat with effort, compelling himself to continue reading. November 14th, 1995. The storm shows no sign of abating. The cattle are succumbing to the cold in the lower pasture. I am unable to reach them by myself. My hip is failing me once more. I sat by the fire this evening and contemplated the telephone. I yearned to contact him. I wished to call Caleb, but I am aware he is occupied with the army. He has his own life now, his own conflicts to navigate. He elected that existence over this one. I will not implore him to return. A man must forge his own path. But God, I miss him. I wish he were here to assist me with carrying the firewood. I wish he were here to hold his mother's hand. The words swam before Caleb's eyes. He recollected 1995. He held the rank of Sergeant First Class and was stationed in Germany. He remembered the telephone ringing in the barracks. He remembered his mother's voice, faint and quivering, inquiring if he could come home for Christmas, and he recalled his response. He had informed her he was unable to. He had stated that the rotation schedule was fully allocated. He had asserted that the mission took precedence. However, this had been a falsehood. He could have gone. He had deliberately chosen not to. He had opted for the structured, disciplined existence of the military over the disarray and hardship of the struggling ranch. He had chosen to evade the visual evidence of his parents' aging, the guilt associated with observing their difficulties while he prospered. He had rationalized that forwarding a monthly check was sufficient. He turned the page. The entry was dated merely 2 days prior to the conflagration that claimed the house and his parents' lives. November 20th, 1995. I harbor the apprehension that we will lose the property. Crow made an appearance today. He offered to purchase it from us for a pittance. He is aware of our predicament. I instructed him to depart from my land. I informed him that this land belongs to Caleb. Even if he never returns, it is his. It constitutes his heritage. Perhaps one day he will comprehend. Perhaps one day he will return and absolve us for our age and perceived obsolescence. The book slipped from Caleb's grasp and descended to the earthen floor. A sound, a jagged, broken exhalation, half sob and half gasp, tore from Caleb's throat. He hunched forward, concealing his face in his hands. The leather of his jacket creaked as his shoulders convulsed with the intensity of his sorrow. He had not been present. When the snow enveloped the barn, he was absent. When the fire commenced, he was not there. When his father confronted Crow alone, he was not present. He had abandoned them to perish in isolation amidst the frigid darkness, under the assumption that their son had prioritized a uniform over his own kin. 30 years of silence. 30 years of self-persuasion that he had fulfilled his obligation. It all dissolved in the damp atmosphere of the root cellar. Ranger reacted instantly. The large canine pressed its body against Caleb's chest, intruding upon the man's personal space. It whimpered softly, a high-pitched, anxious sound, and licked the tears that escaped through Caleb's rugged fingers. The dog's weight was substantial and grounding, a warm anchor amidst a deluge of regret. Caleb encircled the dog's neck with his arms, burying his face in its dense gray fur. He wept uncontrollably, the tears saturating Ranger's coat. He mourned for Jeremiah, who had been too proud to plead. He mourned for Abigail, who had passed away awaiting her son. He mourned for the 30 years he had squandered by fleeing from the truth. The judgment was rendered. He was culpable. He had deserted his post when it was most critical. Gradually, the tempest of grief began to recede, leaving Caleb depleted and exhausted. He reclined, wiping his face with his sleeve. He glanced at the ammunition can, then at the deed lying in the dirt. His father had retained ownership of the land for him. Even at the conclusion, Jeremiah had held the conviction that Caleb would return. Caleb looked upward toward the cellar's ceiling, visualizing the devastated landscape beyond. Somewhere in the obscurity, miles distant in a box canyon, a disabled horse stood in the snow, awaiting succor. A horse named Phoenix. Phoenix was akin to them, abandoned, ensnared, engaged in a conflict it could not surmount alone. Caleb reached out and retrieved the diary. He closed it with gentle care and returned it to the container. "I am incapable of saving them, Ranger," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They are gone." He placed his hand on Ranger's head, feeling the steady cadence of the dog's heartbeat. "But I can save him." The realization settled upon him with the gravity of a directive. Saving Phoenix was no longer solely a matter of animosity toward Harlan Crow. It was no longer merely about obstinacy. It was atonement. It was the sole means of rectifying the imbalance. He had failed Jeremiah and Abigail. He would not fail Phoenix. He arose, his knees audibly popping, and brushed the dirt from his trousers. The grief persisted, a sharp fragment of glass lodged in his heart, but it no longer rendered him immobile. It served as propellant. "We will get some rest, Ranger," Caleb stated, his voice resolute once more. "Tomorrow, we commence rectifying matters." He extinguished the lantern, immersing the cellar in darkness. However, for the initial time in 30 years, Caleb Mercer did not feel entirely adrift. He possessed a mission, and this time, he would not abscond. The morning sun offered no warmth, casting elongated frigid shadows across the box canyon, where Phoenix stood shivering. Caleb Mercer knelt in the frozen mud, his exhalations manifesting as plumes of white vapor before him. He moved a gloved hand down the horse's left foreleg, detecting the heat emanating from the fetlock, even through the thick leather. The swelling was considerable, and when Caleb applied gentle pressure near the coronet band, Phoenix snatched its leg away, emitting a sharp squeal of pain. It was no longer solely the overgrown hooves. An infection had taken root, quite possibly an abscess forming deep within the twisted horn of the hoof wall. Without antibiotics, the infection would disseminate to the bone. Without appropriate implements to remove the extraneous growth, the pressure would never be alleviated. Caleb straightened, his knees cracking in the frigid air. He regarded the horse, whose dark eyes were wide with a mixture of apprehension and supplication. The animal was confined within a body that inflicted torment with every beat of its heart. Quote, 2. Caleb murmured, patting Phoenix's neck. I need to go procure reinforcements. He proceeded back to the truck, Ranger trotting silently at his heel. Caleb occupied the driver's seat and retrieved his antiquated leather wallet. He did not require enumeration of the currency within to ascertain the outcome. There was a $5 bill and 3 ones. He had expended the entirety of his pension check on fuel and the modest provisions from the preceding day. Penicillin necessitated expenditure. High-leverage hoof nippers, the kind robust enough to sever hooves as hard as stone, incurred even greater cost. Caleb initiated the engine, the aged Ford groaning before yielding to ignition. As he navigated the rutted track back toward the main thoroughfare, he observed an approaching cloud of dust. A colossal, pristine white pickup truck obstructed the exit, its chrome grille gleaming like a set of silver teeth. It was Harlan Crow. Caleb halted his truck, the two vehicles confronting each other like adversaries on a narrow bridge. Crow lowered his window, extending his arm with a toothpick clamped between his teeth. He wore a hat that exceeded the value of Caleb's truck, and his countenance was flushed from the warmth of his climate-controlled cabin. Going to town, Mercer, Crow projected, his voice resonating over the idling engines. Giving up already? Caleb lowered his window, allowing the biting cold air to assail his face. He adjusted the collar of his worn brown leather jacket, the red and navy plaid flannel shirt beneath, offering minimal defense against the wind. Just attending to some matters, Harlan, Caleb responded evenly. Crow emitted a laugh, a harsh, grating sound. I observed you removing refuse from that barn yesterday. You are attempting to impersonate a rancher amidst a graveyard. You know, my offer remains valid. I will disburse cash today. You can procure a comfortable warm coat and a bus ticket to a location that does not exude the odor of failure. Caleb regarded the man, truly examined him. He encountered a man who quantified the world in acres and monetary value. A person who perceived living beings solely as assets or encumbrances. Leave my path, Caleb commanded, his voice suppressed and menacing. Crow sneered, conceding defeat with a headshake. As you wish, but when that aged vehicle breaks down on the open road, do not solicit my assistance for a tow. Crow sped off, veering around Caleb's truck and propelling a shower of gravel that struck Caleb's door with a rattle. Caleb observed his departure, his grip tightening on the steering wheel until his knuckles were stark white. The ire surged within him, intense and persistent, yet he suppressed it. Wrath would not procure antibiotics. He proceeded into the town, the miles dissipating in quietude. Ranger rested beside him, his head on Caleb's thigh, offering hushed, unwavering solace. Caleb halted before a brick edifice bearing a sign that proclaimed, Novak's Pawn and Gun. The windows featured bars, and the display was a disorderly assortment of musical instruments, adornments, and implements. It was a venue frequented by individuals in dire straits seeking to exchange their past for a few additional days of subsistence. Caleb deactivated the engine. He paused for a moment, gazing at his left wrist. Adorned there was a Hamilton Field timepiece. The fabric strap was worn and had faded from an olive hue to a pallid gray. The crystal casing bore scratches from encounters with rocks, tank hatches, and barbed wire. He had acquired it in 1985, shortly after achieving the rank of sergeant. It had accompanied him through desert deployments, through training exercises in the mud of Georgia, and through the protracted, silent vigils of guard duty in Germany. It had precisely measured the timing of mortar barrages and medevac flights. It had tallied the seconds of his life for 40 years. It represented the sole valuable possession he owned. Caleb gently unfastened the strap. The skin beneath was pallid, a spectral imprint of the band that had shielded it from the sun for decades. He held the watch in his palm, appreciating its familiar heft. It felt akin to holding a fragment of his own being. He opened the truck door and entered the establishment. The interior air was fragrant with gun oil and ancient dust. Novak, a balding gentleman with substantial spectacles and a disposition as keen as the knives in his display case, stood behind the counter. "Assistance required?" Novak inquired, without diverting his gaze from the ledger he was perusing. Caleb approached the counter and laid the watch upon the glass surface. The metal emitted a soft clink. Novak looked up. He scrutinized the watch, then Caleb. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "Hamilton," Novak grunted. "Mechanical, late 1980s model." 1985, Caleb corrected. "Original movement. Never lost a second." Novak withdrew a magnifying loupe from his pocket and screwed it into his eye. He examined the casing, the dial, and the internal mechanism. "It has endured hardship. Crystal is abraded. Strap is worn out." "It functions," Caleb stated, his voice strained. "That is the paramount concern." Novak sighed, setting the watch down. "It is a fine piece. Collectors are drawn to its history. I can offer you 200. Caleb experienced a hollow pang in his chest. $200 for 40 years of recollections. Yet his thoughts turned to Phoenix. He recalled the heat in the horse's leg and the agony evident in its eyes. He envisioned the diary sequestered within the ammunition receptacle and the implicit obligation to his father. Quote 9. Caleb proposed, quote 10. Novak regarded him, truly perceiving him for the initial instance. He observed the faded flannel, the weathered leather jacket, and the underlying desperation in the gray eyes that refused to implore. Novak inclined his head slowly. Quote 11. Caleb hesitated, his fingertip tracing the periphery of the watch one final time. Quote 12. Caleb whispered. Novak opened the cash drawer and meticulously counted out the banknotes. Quote 13. Caleb accepted the currency, his hands trembling slightly. He noted the vacant expanse on his wrist. Quote 14. Caleb stated, his voice coarse. Quote 15. An hour later, Caleb was back at the Box Canyon. He possessed a vial of penicillin, syringes, antiseptic, and a pair of heavy-duty hoof clippers that resembled oversized bolt cutters. The sun arced high in the sky, yet the air retained its sharp nip. Caleb approached Phoenix cautiously. The equine was apprehensive, twitching its ears as it perceived the peculiar metallic implement in Caleb's grasp. "It's all right, Phoenix," Caleb murmured, his tone placid and steady. "We are going to mend you." He administered the antibiotics first, a swift jab in the neck muscle that caused the horse to start, but Phoenix was too enfeebled to resist significantly. Now commenced the demanding phase. Caleb needed to trim the excessively curled toes. He had to sever inches of solidified hoof wall to enable the horse to stand level for the first time in months. He moved to the fore left leg. "Lift it, son," Caleb commanded gently, stroking the cannon bone. He applied pressure to the chestnut, signaling the horse to elevate its foot. Phoenix demurred, trembling. Bearing weight on 3 legs was agonizing for him, but gradually he shifted his balance and raised the hoof. Caleb caught it, cradling the leg between his thighs. The odor of decay was more pronounced now. He clenched his teeth against the discomfort in his own lower back. At 65 years of age, he bent beneath the weight of a 1,000-pound animal, wielding a substantial tool. He positioned the jaws of the clippers over the curled toe. It was thick, contorted like a ram's horn. Caleb applied pressure to the handles. The hoof was as unyielding as concrete. Caleb exerted himself, the muscles in his arms burning, his face flushed crimson with effort. He emitted a groan, channeling his entire body weight into the cut. Snap! A segment of the hoof detached, falling onto the earth. Phoenix recoiled its leg in alarm, nearly toppling Caleb. The horse scrambled, its eyes wide with terror, snorting loudly. Quote. Caleb exclaimed, stepping back. Phoenix was panting rapidly, its pain threshold surpassed. It was poised to bolt, even on its impaired limbs. If it panicked now, it risked fracturing a leg or crushing Caleb against the canyon wall. Quote. 1. Caleb implored, breathing heavily. The large shepherd had been observing intently from a few yards distant. Upon hearing the command, Ranger rose and calmly approached the horse. It neither barked nor growled. It simply entered the horse's personal space with an aura of absolute authority and composure. Ranger halted directly before Phoenix's lowered head. The canine sat down, its back erect, and gazed up at the horse. Then, slowly, Ranger reclined, resting its chin on its paws, exhaling a prolonged, measured breath. It was a gesture of peace. A signal conveying, quote 2. Phoenix peered at the dog. The predator lay at its feet, exposing its neck, utterly relaxed. The horse's innate instincts warred with the visual evidence. If the wolf was quiescent, there was no threat. Phoenix's respiration subsided. Its head lowered, sniffing the air mere inches above Ranger's ears. Ranger remained undisturbed. It maintained a posture of tranquil composure, a grounding anchor amidst the tempest of the horse's fear. Caleb observed the interaction, a sense of awe washing over him. It mirrored Ranger's ability to soothe traumatized soldiers in the field. The canine absorbed the anxiety of others and neutralized it with its own steadfastness. "Good boy, Ranger," Caleb whispered. He repositioned himself near the horse. Phoenix flinched, but did not withdraw this time. Its attention was fixed on the dog. Caleb retrieved the foot once more. His back protested vehemently. Sharp stabs of pain shot down his spine. He disregarded them. He clamped the clippers onto the subsequent section of the hoof. He applied pressure. His arms trembled. Sweat dripped from his brow, freezing on his skin. He thought of the watch resting behind the glass at Novak's. He recalled his father perishing in solitude amidst the snow. "I shall not fail you," Caleb ground out. Snap. Another piece of hoof fell away. They labored thus for an hour, Caleb perspiring and exerting himself. His body pushed to its absolute limit. Phoenix trembling, but remaining still. Ranger lying immobile at the horse's feet. A silent guardian of the calm. When Caleb finally released the horse's leg, the grotesque curvature was gone. The hoof was rough and unsightly, but it was flat. Phoenix tested its weight. It placed the foot on the ground. For the first time in a year, its frog made contact with the earth. The tendon relaxed. The horse emitted a prolonged, shuddering exhalation. It blinked, the frenzied desperation in its eyes replaced by an expression of bewilderment, and then relief. Caleb slumped back against the canyon wall, sliding until he settled on the dirt. His hands were cramping so severely he could barely unclench them. His jacket was soiled with mud and perspiration. He looked at his bare left wrist, feeling the phantom weight of the watch. He observed Phoenix standing squarely on the trimmed foot. He noted Ranger, who lifted its head and offered a single wag of its tail. Caleb offered a smile, a weary, pained expression that reached his eyes. "Worth it," Caleb whispered into the empty canyon. It was worth every second. The sun had long since descended behind the jagged prominence of the mountains, plunging the Shadow Creek Valley into an absolute darkness. The cold was a tangible entity, a heavy shroud of frost that enveloped the remnants of the Mercer ranch, transforming the exhalations of every living being into ephemeral plumes of white vapor. Within the root cellar, the atmosphere was warmer, heated by the congregating bodies of the peculiar, diverse family Caleb Mercer had assembled. Phoenix, the impaired Mustang, stood in a corner, its head bowed as the antibiotics combated the fever in its bloodstream. A number of wild chickens, which had begun to roost near the barn, had been confined to a makeshift enclosure by the entrance. Ranger lay near the doorway, its chin resting on its paws, its amber eyes reflecting the faint luminescence of the embers within the small camping stove Caleb had ignited. However, outside, the wind carried a peculiar scent, sweet, potent, and perilous. It was the aroma of infection. The affliction in Phoenix's hoof, now discharging due to Caleb's intervention, emanated a distinctive smell of copper and decay. Mixed with the scent of roosting fowl, it formed an olfactory emblem that traveled miles downwind, piercing the sterile aroma of snow and pine. High on the crest overlooking the chasm, a movement occurred. It advanced with a liquid, formidable elegance, its paws broad and cushioned, to tread silently upon the frozen surface of the snow. It was a puma, a mature male, compelled from higher altitudes by the scarcity of deer and the severe cold. It was famished, and the scent wafting from the valley floor promised sustenance that was feeble, ensnared, and accessible. The magnificent feline crept down the rocky declivity, its underside close to the ground. It advanced like vapor, a shadow more profound than the surrounding night. It halted at the edge of the clearing where the stone structure stood, its amber eyes fixated on the wooden portals of the root cellar. It could discern the faint rustling of feathers and the labored respiration of the equine. Within the cellar, RER's ears twitched. The aged German shepherd remained immobile, yet its entire frame stiffened. The fur along its spine bristled in a jagged line. It parted its mouth slightly, sampling the air. Amidst the odors of moist soil, old fodder, and disinfectant, there was a novel element. A musky, wild feline scent, that of a predator. Ranger recognized this aroma. Deep within its ancestral faculties, alarm bells resonated. Instinct urged it to spring forth, to charge the door, to vocalize with a ferocity that would repel the intruder through sheer aggression. This was the behavior of a farm dog. This was the behavior of a wolf. But Ranger was more than simply a canine. It was a soldier. It adjusted its weight, and a sharp pang shot through its hips. The chill had permeated its joints, rendering them stiff and aching. It was 10 years of age. It was no longer as swift as it once was. If it charged a mountain lion of such magnitude, it would be dispatched before reaching the snow. The cat would employ its superior mass and talons to disembowel it in mere seconds. And once Ranger fell, Caleb and the horse would be vulnerable. Ranger suppressed the growl intensifying in its throat. It compelled its musculature to adhere to its conditioning, overriding the primal impulse to engage. It needed to awaken the general. It required the man with the firearm. Ranger rose. It moved to the side of the cot where Caleb slumbered, enveloped in heavy woolen coverings. The dog placed its frigid muzzle against Caleb's ear and emitted a sound that was not a bark, but a low, insistent vocalization. Caleb stirred, groaning as he shifted. "Ranger, what is it?" Ranger retreated and regarded the door. Then it delivered the signal. It was a precise sequence it had acquired years prior while on patrol in sweltering arid regions. 3 sharp, distinct barks, evenly spaced. Woof, woof, woof. A pause, then again. Woof, woof, woof. Caleb's eyes snapped open. The haze of slumber vanished instantly, replaced by a surge of adrenaline that caused his heart to pound against his ribs. This was not a request for egress. This was not a bark at a rodent. This was the alert signal. It signified an adversary, proximate, in peril. Caleb flung the blankets aside. He posed no inquiries. He reached out and grasped the lever-action rifle standing against the stone wall. It was cold metal in his grasp, familiar and lethal. He cycled around into the chamber, the mechanical click sounding unnervingly loud in the confined space. "Remain," Caleb commanded in a whisper. He advanced to the door, stepping into his boots without bothering to fasten them. He wore his faded red and navy plaid shirt, and he seized his heavy brown leather jacket, draping it over his shoulders, yet leaving it unfastened. Caleb kicked the door open, and stepped into the biting nocturnal air, the rifle raised to his shoulder. The moon's beam pierced the clouds, illuminating the yard in a wash of pale silver. Initially, Caleb discerned nothing. The wind whistled through the remnants of the domicile. The arboreal shadows danced upon the snow. Then he perceived the eyes. 20 yards distant, crouched near the corner of the stone barn, 2 orbs of reflective gold blazed in the darkness. The mountain lion was colossal, its tawny coat merging seamlessly with the dry winter grasses peeking through the snow. It was aligned low to the ground, its musculature tensed like metallic springs, poised to spring towards the open portal where the equine scent was most potent. The feline emitted a sound felt more than heard, a low, guttural resonance that vibrated within Caleb's chest. It bared its teeth, long and white, hissing its displeasure at the interruption. Caleb's digit tightened on the trigger. He had the opportunity. He could place a projectile directly between those golden irises and permanently neutralize the threat. Yet, he hesitated. He observed the creature, starving and desperate in the winter chill, merely endeavoring to persist. It possessed no malevolence. It was simply hungry. Caleb readjusted his aim. He directed the muzzle towards a patch of frozen earth 3 feet in front of the feline's paws. He depressed the trigger. The rifle recoiled against his shoulder, a sharp, punishing backlash. The report of the discharge shattered the valley's serenity, an instantaneous thunderclap that reverberated off the canyon walls. A geyser of soil and snow erupted before the mountain lion. The feline flinched, its predatory focus disrupted by the violent noise and the stinging spray of debris. It snarled, a high-pitched cry of vexation, and then turned. With a leap of extraordinary strength, it cleared the crumbling stone parapet of the barn and vanished into the shadowy tree line. Caleb swiftly actuated the rifle's lever, expelling the expended casing and chambering a fresh projectile. He maintained his posture, surveying the periphery, his respiration labored and gasping. He waited a minute. 2. Silence returned to the valley, profound and frigid. Clear, Caleb murmured to himself, lowering the weapon. He turned and re-entered the root cellar. Phoenix was pressing himself into the rear corner, eyes wide with dread, trembling violently. The fowl were silent, rendered immobile by instinctual fear. And Ranger stood precisely where Caleb had instructed him to remain. The aged canine was shivering. It was not from apprehension, Caleb knew. It was the adrenaline depletion. The chemical surge of the fight-or-flight response was dissipating, leaving RER's ancient muscles weak and its arthritic articulations throbbing. Caleb set the rifle down and dropped to his knees beside the dog. He extended his hand and buried his fingers in the thick, coarse fur of Ranger's neck. "You performed admirably, companion," Caleb stated, his voice thick with sentiment. "You performed exceptionally well." He ran his hands down Ranger's back to his hindquarters. The dog flinched slightly when Caleb touched its left flank. Caleb comprehended the cost to the dog of remaining still. Every instinct within Ranger's being had screamed at it to attack, to defend its pack with force. But Ranger had opted for discipline. It had placed its trust in Caleb to be the instrument. Had Ranger attacked, Caleb would be interring his dearest companion in the frozen earth the following dawn. Brotherhood was not about sacrificing for one another. It was about coexisting for one another. It was about recognizing one's limitations and depending on one's partner to bridge the deficit. Caleb embraced the dog, pressing his face into the coarse gray coat. Ranger leaned his full weight against Caleb, releasing a long, quivering exhalation. Caleb moved to his provisions and located the bottle of canine aspirin he kept for challenging days. He encased the pill in a scrap of dried beef and administered it to Ranger. Subsequently, he collected the woolen blankets and fashioned a thick bedding on the floor near the stove. "Recline," Caleb commanded softly. Ranger pivoted stiffly, its limbs trembling as it lowered itself onto the blankets. It emitted a groan of relief as the burden was lifted from its hips. Caleb sat beside it, disregarding the chill seeping through his own trousers. He commenced massaging the dog's hind legs, his calloused thumbs delving deeply into the musculature, alleviating the tension. Ranger closed its eyes, its respiration decelerating as the discomfort began to recede under Caleb's ministrations. Outdoors, the wind wailed anew, a reminder that nature was both harsh and apathetic. Yet within the confined circle of light, there was warmth. Caleb observed Phoenix, who had calmed, watching the quiet rapport between the man and the dog. "We maintained our position, Ranger," Caleb whispered into the darkness. "We held the line." He remained there for an extended period, rubbing the aged dog's legs until his own hands cramped. He contemplated the famished mountain lion in the gloom. He considered Harland Crow, secure in his opulent dwelling. And he reflected upon this motley assembly of damaged entities, an elderly gentleman, a disabled steed, and an arthritic hound striving to witness another dawn. They were outmatched in armament. They were outnumbered. But as long as they possessed this discipline, this mutual reliance, they were unbroken. Caleb ultimately reclined beside Ranger, drawing the remaining blankets over both of them. He rested one hand on the dog's flank, requiring the tangible connection to resume slumber. "Rest now, soldier," Caleb murmured. "I have the watch." The adrenaline that had sustained Caleb Mercer during the confrontation with the mountain lion dissipated as swiftly as it had manifested, leaving behind a vacant ache in his bones and a trembling weakness in his limbs. The root cellar, once a refuge from the biting wind, now felt constricting. The air was dense with the metallic tang of infection and the damp musk of the earth. Caleb barred the sturdy wooden door, his hands trembling so intensely he could barely secure the bolt. He turned back to the small camping stove, intending to boil water, but his legs refused to support him. He collapsed onto the mattress, the worn woolen blanket chafing against his cheek. In the corner, Phoenix was not resting. The Mustang stood with its head bowed, its breathing ragged and shallow. Sweat darkened its muddy coat despite the frigid temperature of the cellar. Caleb compelled himself to stand, battling the wave of dizziness that tilted the room on its axis. He stumbled towards the horse, peeling off his glove to touch Phoenix's neck. The animal radiated heat like a furnace. Its skin burned to the touch. The infection in its hoof, exacerbated by the stress of the hoof trimming and the terror of the unseen predator outside, had erupted into a raging fever. The antibiotics Caleb had administered earlier were engaged in a fierce battle within the horse's bloodstream. However, at this moment, the illness was prevailing. "Hold on, son," Caleb whispered, his voice sounding faint and distant even to himself. "You simply must fight it." He attempted to return to the stove, but a sudden spasm in his lower back forced him to his knees. The pain was searing, a jagged bolt of lightning tearing through his spine. He gasped, curling onto the dirt floor. His own body, pushed beyond its limits by the cold, the exertion, and the sheer burden of his 65 years, was finally giving out. Caleb crawled back to the mattress, hauling himself onto it with his last reserves of strength. He pulled the blankets up to his chin, yet he could not generate warmth. His teeth chattered, a rhythmic clicking sound echoing in the quiet cellar. He closed his eyes, and the darkness behind his eyelids began to swirl. Time lost its significance. The howling of the wind outside the door underwent a transformation. It was no longer the Montana wind lashing through the pines of Shadow Creek. It sounded like the roar of incoming mortar rounds. The crackling of wood in the stove resembled the sound of distant small arms fire. Caleb tossed and turned, entangled in the blankets. The fever seized his mind, pulling him backward through the decades. He was no longer an elderly man in a root cellar. He was a young sergeant in 1971, huddled in a muddy bunker, the scent of cordite and rain filling his nostrils. "Stay down," Caleb yelled, his voice raspy and wild. "Keep your head down." In the corner, Phoenix shifted his weight, his hoof scraping against the stone floor. To Caleb's fevered imagination, it was the sound of a boot dragging through mud. He looked at the horse, but saw no Mustang. In the dim, flickering light of the stove, the animal's silhouette twisted and distorted. Caleb perceived a young soldier, his uniform torn and bloodied, leaning against the sandbags. It was Private Miller, the boy from Arkansas who had never returned home. "Miller," Caleb croaked, extending a trembling hand. "Don't close your eyes, Miller. The medevac is coming. Do you hear me? The bird is 5 minutes out." Phoenix emitted a low, pained groan. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. The guilt that had shadowed him for 30 years. The guilt of surviving when others had not. The guilt of abandoning his parents. It all converged in this moment. He had to save him. He could not permit another one to die on his watch. Quote 6. Caleb murmured, tears escaping his eyes. Quote 7. He attempted to rise to go to his fallen comrade, but his body was pinned by an invisible weight. The shadows on the wall seemed to stretch, reaching for him like grasping hands. The heat in the room was oppressive, a jungle humidity that choked his throat. Quote 8. Caleb shouted, panic rising in his chest. Quote 9. From the darkness near the door, a shape stirred. Ranger had been observing his master with mounting anxiety. The old German shepherd recognized the signs of distress. He heard the change in Caleb's breathing, the erratic rhythm of his heart, and the scent of fear and sickness emanating from him. Ranger had witnessed this before. He had seen it in the veterans he visited in hospital wards after his service days concluded. He had seen it in the young handlers who awoke screaming in the night. The ghost sickness. That's what the dogs knew it to be. The time when humans retreated to a place dogs could not follow. A place filled with loud noises and fear. Ranger stood, his own joints stiff and aching, but he disregarded the pain. His mission had shifted. He was no longer guarding against the mountain lion. He was guarding Caleb's mind. The dog walked to the mattress. Caleb was thrashing, murmuring names of men long deceased, his hands grasping at empty air. Ranger refrained from barking. Barking would only contribute to the chaos in Caleb's mind. Instead, the dog climbed onto the mattress. He was heavy, over 80 pounds of solid muscle and fur. He stepped carefully over Caleb's legs and lay down directly on the man's chest. This was a technique known as deep pressure therapy. Ranger utilized his own body weight to ground Caleb, providing a physical anchor that was real and undeniable. Caleb gasped as the weight settled upon him. Quote, Ranger lowered his head. He began to lick Caleb's face. His tongue was rough and wet, a sensation impossible to ignore. He licked Caleb's cheek, his forehead, the tears streaming down his nose. He whined softly, a low vibrating sound in his throat that resonated through Caleb's chest. I am here. I am real. This is now. The wetness on his face startled Caleb. The rough texture of the tongue scraped against his stubble. The smell of wet dog fur filled his nostrils, overpowering the phantom scent of the jungle. The weight on his chest was heavy, warm, and solid. It was not the weight of sandbags or fallen debris. It was a living entity. Caleb blinked, his eyes focusing on the gray and white face hovering inches from his own. He observed the amber eyes filled with a gentle, worried intelligence. Ranger, Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. Ranger licked his face again, firmly sweeping away the confusion. Caleb took a shuddering breath. The walls of the bunker dissolved, revealing the stone sides of the root cellar. The sound of artillery faded into the whistling of the Montana wind. The dying soldier in the corner resolved back into the form of the horse Phoenix, who was watching them with heavy, tired eyes. Caleb lifted a hand, his fingers trembling, and buried them in the thick fur of Ranger's neck. He clung to it as if drowning, the dog his only piece of driftwood. Quote, 3. Caleb said, his voice shaking. Quote, Ranger rested his chin on Caleb's shoulder, his breathing synchronizing with the man's. He remained there, a heavy, warm blanket against the chills that racked Caleb's body. Slowly, the panic receded. The ghosts retreated back into the shadows of the past, unable to withstand the simple, undeniable reality of the dog's love. Caleb lay there for a long time, tears flowing freely now, not from terror, but from relief. He stroked Ranger's back repeatedly. "Thank you, buddy," he whispered. "Thank you." Exhaustion finally claimed him, but this time it was a natural sleep. Ranger did not move. He remained on watch, his body shielding Caleb's heart, observing the darkness until his own eyes grew heavy. The morning sun pierced through the cracks in the wooden door, slicing into the gloom like a laser. Dust motes danced in the beams of light. Caleb awoke with a start. His mouth was as dry as sandpaper, and his back felt as though it had been pummeled with a hammer, but his mind was clear. The fever had broken. He pushed the blankets aside and sat up, groaning as his stiff muscles protested. Ranger slept at the foot of the mattress, curled into a tight ball. At Caleb's movement, the dog's tail gave a lazy thump against the floor, but he did not rise. He had stood watch all night. He deserved his rest. Caleb looked toward the corner. Phoenix was standing. His head was up. Caleb scrambled to his feet, ignoring the protest of his knees. He went to the horse and placed a hand on its neck. The skin was warm, but the burning heat had dissipated. Sweat had dried on the horse's coat, leaving the fur matted and spiked. But the fever had broken. Phoenix turned his head and nudged Caleb's shoulder with his velvety muzzle. It was a gentle, tentative gesture, but to Caleb it felt like a shout of victory. "You made it," Caleb whispered, resting his forehead against the horse's neck. Quote 1. Phoenix let out a long breath, blowing warm air into Caleb's hair. The infection was still present, and the road to recovery would be arduous. But the crisis had passed. The horse had battled through the darkness and emerged on the other side. Caleb surveyed the small, dirty root cellar. It smelled of sickness and animals, but in the morning light, it resembled a palace. It was a fortress that had withstood the night. He walked over to Ranger and knelt down. The old dog opened one eye. "We're all still here, Ranger," Caleb said, a smile cracking his dry lips. "We walked through the door, and we all came back." He stood up and walked to the cellar door, unbolting it and pushing it open. The blinding white light of the snow-covered valley flooded in. The air was crisp and clean, purifying his lungs of sickness. Caleb Mercer stepped out into the morning. He was weak, he was in pain, and he felt older than he ever had. But as he gazed at the sun rising over the jagged peaks of the mountains, he knew one thing with certainty. The ghosts were gone. Only the living remained. The sky over the Shadow Creek Valley did not darken gradually. It bruised. Deep purples and angry charcoals rolled over the mountain peaks, engulfing the light with terrifying speed. The air pressure dropped so abruptly that Caleb Mercer felt his ears pop, and the ache in his knees flared into a steady, grinding discomfort. This was not merely a winter storm. It was a white hurricane. The kind of blizzard the old-timers in Montana spoke of in hushed tones, the kind that buried fences and froze cattle in their tracks. Caleb stood by the entrance of the root cellar, observing the distant road through a pair of cracked binoculars he had retrieved from his truck. A convoy of vehicles was receding from the valley floor, heading toward the paved highway and the safety of the town. A pristine white pickup truck, its chrome gleaming even in the fading light, led the procession. Harlan Crow was departing. The man who asserted dominion over the valley, who treated land and livestock as mere pawns, was withdrawing. He had likely relocated his prize animals to warmer barns in the lowlands and was now escaping to his opulent mansion, complete with fireplaces and generators. He was abandoning the valley to the brutal embrace of the ice, and he was leaving Caleb behind. "Good riddance," Caleb mumbled, lowering his binoculars. He turned his back on the receding taillights and surveyed his own command post. The root cellar, a robust structure built by his father Jeremiah in 1955 using river stones and hefty timber, was nonetheless ancient. The mortar between the stones had deteriorated in sections, creating openings through which the wind could keen. The wooden door, though substantial, had warped. Against a typical snowfall, it would suffice. Against what was imminent, it was porous. If the temperature plunged to 20 degrees below zero, as warned by the radio in his truck, the mere drafts would prove fatal. Caleb observed Ranger, the old dog sitting stoically in the snow, sniffing the air with an expression of profound concentration. "We must seal the hatches, Ranger," Caleb instructed, his voice steady, despite the escalating urgency within his chest. "We're digging in." Caleb moved with the deliberate efficiency of a combat engineer. He lacked modern insulation or caulk. His resources were the earth and the detritus of the farm. He proceeded to the dilapidated barn and extracted bales of decaying hay. These he transported to the small clearing before the cellar. Next, he fetched a shovel and began excavating the bank of the creek where the water kept the mud from freezing. He filled 2 5-gallon buckets with the thick, clay-rich sludge. The labor was arduous. His breath emerged in white plumes, crystallizing on his beard. He incorporated the straw into the mud, working it with a stick until it formed a dense, fibrous mortar. It was a technique as ancient as the frontier itself, wattle and daub, employed to insulate log cabins against prairie gales. Caleb took handfuls of the chilling mixture and began to pack it into the fissures on the exterior of the root cellar. The cold mud instantly numbed his fingers, biting through his gloves, yet he persisted. He meticulously worked his way around the stone foundation, seeking every crevice, every gap through which warmth might dissipate. Inside the cellar, Phoenix watched him through the open doorway. The Mustang was standing better that day, the fever having subsided, though he remained weak. He masticated a wisp of hay slowly, his dark eyes tracking Caleb's actions. Once the exterior was fortified, Caleb turned his attention to the door. He went to his truck and unfurled the heavy canvas tarps he stored in the bed. They were stiff with coal dust and carried the scent of oil and aged machinery. He draped the largest tarp over the exterior of the door frame, securing it to the timber headers with rusty nails drawn from his pocket. He positioned heavy stones along the bottom edge of the canvas to create a seal against the ground. It was unrefined. It resembled a hasty repair on a foundering vessel, but it served as a barrier. It was a secondary skin for their sanctuary. The first snowflakes began to fall just as Caleb completed securing the tarp. These were not gentle, drifting flakes. They were sharp pellets of ice propelled by a wind that had suddenly found its voice. The trees surrounding the homestead commenced to groan, their branches flailing in the tempest. Quote, Caleb announced. He entered the cellar. Phoenix was already present, occupying the rear corner. The horse seemed to grasp that this small stone chamber was the sole safe haven in existence. He shifted his weight, his trimmed hooves providing a stable stance, though he still favored his left leg. Caleb retrieved the crate containing the 4 wild chickens he had managed to capture over the preceding days. The birds were silent, huddling together for warmth. He placed the crate on a high shelf, away from the floor's drafts. Then there was the matter of the stray. For a week, a small tortoiseshell cat had lingered on the periphery of the ranch. It was a gaunt creature, missing half of its left ear, likely a casualty of frostbite from a previous winter or a skirmish with a raccoon. It had observed Caleb from the rafters of the ruined barn, accepting the scraps of food he left out, but never permitting him within 10 feet. Caleb scanned the yard. The snow was intensifying. A white curtain obscured the tree line. "Kitty," Caleb called out, feeling absurd. "Here, cat." "Nothing." Caleb swore softly. He could not abandon the creature to the elements. In this storm, such a small cat would freeze solid within an hour. He retrieved a tin of sardines from his supply cache, a delicacy he had been reserving for himself. He pried open the lid. The potent, oily aroma cut through the frigid air. He placed the tin just inside the cellar door's threshold. He waited. Ranger sat beside him, motionless. The dog comprehended the strategy. A minute elapsed. The wind shrieked around the corners of the stone walls. Then, a shadow detached itself from the ruins of the porch. The cat moved low to the ground, its belly brushing the snow. It paused at the tarp, sniffing with suspicion. Hunger warred with apprehension. The scent of the sardines was irresistible. The cat darted in, snatched a mouthful of fish, and attempted to flee. Caleb acted swiftly, swinging the heavy wooden door shut. He did not yet secure it, but he obstructed the exit. The cat hissed, arching its back, retreating to the corner farthest from Ranger. "You'll thank me later," Caleb grunted. He pulled the heavy door fully closed and engaged the iron bolt. He then dropped the heavy canvas top over the inside of the door frame, creating an airlock. The silence was sudden and striking. The roar of the wind was muffled to a low, distant moan. The draft that had been plaguing the room vanished, halted by the mud and the canvas. Caleb ignited the camping stove. The blue flame hissed to life, casting long, dancing shadows against the stone walls. Now, the waiting commenced. Caleb settled onto his mattress, leaning his back against the wall. Ranger curled up beside him, pressing his warm flank against Caleb's leg. Phoenix stood in his corner, chewing with a steady rhythm. The chickens settled down with soft clucking sounds. Even the stray cat, realizing it was not in immediate danger of being consumed, crouched near the stove, meticulously licking the sardine oil from its whiskers. The temperature outside began its precipitous decline. Caleb could feel the cold attempting to permeate the stone, searching for any vulnerability, but the chamber held firm. It was not solely the stove sustaining their warmth. Caleb closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. The air was thick. It carried the scent of horse, of damp dog, of wood smoke, and earth. Yet, it was warm. A 1,000-pound horse generates an immense quantity of body heat. Combined with the warmth emanating from Caleb, Ranger, and even the small birds and the cat, the confined, sealed space began to transform. It operated as a biological furnace. The thermal mass of the stone walls absorbed the heat and radiated it back. Outside, the world was succumbing. The thermometer was predicted to drop to 30 degrees below zero that night. The wind chill would strip flesh from bone, but within, the temperature registered 60 degrees and was steadily climbing. Caleb opened his eyes and surveyed his makeshift bunker. In the dim illumination, he observed Phoenix's dark eyes regarding him with tranquil trust. The horse lowered his head and emitted a long, dusty sigh. He saw Ranger, his muzzle frosted with age, sleeping peacefully, attuned to the knowledge that his master had secured their perimeter. He observed the cat, which had crept closer and was now curled into a tight ball near Phoenix's forehooves, drawing warmth from the colossal herbivore. A lump formed in Caleb's throat, tight and poignant. He had spent 30 years in solitude. He had resided in barracks with hundreds of men, yet had felt isolated. He had occupied inexpensive apartments where he was unaware of his neighbors' names. He had convinced himself that he needed no one, that he was better off as an independent entity, unencumbered by connections that could be severed by death or distance. He had been mistaken. This was not merely a collection of stray animals and a worn-out old man. This was a unit, a squad, a family. They were all castaways. The horse with the malformed feet, the dog too elderly for active duty, the cat with the absent ear, the chickens left behind by prior inhabitants, and the soldier who had absconded from his own internal conflict. They had all been discarded by the world, left to perish in the desolation. But together, huddled in a subterranean refuge while the blizzard raged, they were alive. They were warm. Caleb extended his hand and rested it on Ranger's head. He met Phoenix's gaze. "We are all right," Caleb whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "We are safe." He drew his legs up and clasped his arms around his knees. He listened to the breathing of the animals. It was a symphony of existence, a rhythmic proclamation of survival against the void of the storm. For the first time since 1995, Caleb Mercer did not experience the suffocating burden of loneliness. He missed his parents. He mourned the lost years. But he was no longer submerged in the past. He was the commander of this stronghold. He was the guardian of this peculiar, vulnerable family, and that purpose radiated a warmth superior to any stove. The wind howled externally, battering the stone walls, demanding ingress. Let it blow, Caleb thought, closing his eyes and resting his head against the earthen wall. Let it blow. We are not moving. The night extended, long and dark, but within the root cellar, the hearts of the forgotten pulsed in unison, defying the frigid temperatures. The storm abated just before dawn, leaving the Shadow Creek Valley blanketed beneath 3 feet of pristine, blindingly white snow. The wind, which had screamed like a banshee for 24 hours, finally exhausted its fury, yielding a silence so profound it felt palpable. The sun ascended above the eastern summits, not with warmth, but with a frigid, crystalline radiance that transformed the frozen terrain into a dazzling expanse. At 10 in the morning, the tranquility was fractured by the roar of engines. A robust snowplow from the County Roads Department spearheaded the procession, carving a single lane along the serpentine path toward the Mercer estate. Following in its wake was a black Sheriff Department SUV and Harlan Crow's white pickup truck. Within the SUV, Sheriff Tom Weiler's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles stark white. He was a man of few words, a Gulf War veteran who had witnessed ample death to recognize its signature. He harbored a deep apprehension regarding what lay ahead. The temperature had plummeted to 35 degrees below zero overnight. With no electricity, no running water, and a collapsed residence, the statistical probability of survival for a 65-year-old man was virtually nil. Harlan Crow had contacted him at first light, his voice feigning solicitude, yet betraying an underlying pragmatic eagerness. "We need to head up there, Tom. The old man is likely a popsicle. We need to secure the property before the scavengers arrive." Weiler had concurred, though the notion left a bitter aftertaste. He halted the SUV near the remnants of the front gate, which barely emerged from the snowdrifts. Crow pulled up alongside, lowering his window. The affluent rancher appeared refreshed, well-rested, and impatient. "Let's get this over with," Crow called out, his breath misting in the frigid air. "I have a crew arriving in an hour to commence clearing the debris." Weiler exited his vehicle, his boots crunching audibly on the compacted snow. "Hold your horses, Harlan," he stated, his voice devoid of inflection. "This is a welfare check, not a foreclosure. Stay behind me." They proceeded past the ruins of the main house. The charred timbers were capped with thick snow formations, resembling gravestones in an overlooked cemetery. The air was biting, stinging Weiler's exposed cheeks. He surveyed the surroundings, searching for any snowdrift that might conceal a frozen vehicle or a body. Quote, Crow remarked, indicating the old Ford pickup buried up to its windows near the barn. "Poor fool likely ran out of gas, trying to stay warm." Weiler moved toward the truck, clearing the snow from the driver's side window. He peered inside. It was empty. He frowned and turned his attention to the stone barn. The roof had succumbed further to the weight of the snow, forming a chaotic heap of wood and slate. Survival within seemed impossible. "Perhaps he attempted to walk out," Crow suggested, kicking at a drift. "If he did, we'll find him when the spring thaw arrives." Weiler was about to radio dispatch to request a search dog when a subtle movement caught his eye. Quote, 10. Weiler said, pointing toward the hill situated behind the ruins. Crow squinted into the glare. Quote, 11. Quote, 12, Weiler insisted. Quote, 13. A thin gray ribbon of wood smoke ascended steadily into the still atmosphere. It was not the acrid smoke indicative of a disaster, but rather the gentle, rhythmic exhalation of a controlled fire. It emanated from a low earth mound near the creek. Quote, 14. Weiler whispered. They began to trudge through the deep snow, their breathing heavy in the rarefied mountain air. As they approached, The scene resolved itself in a manner that defied all of Harlan Crow's expectations. The area before the root cellar had been cleared. A path had been meticulously shoveled by hand from the heavy wooden door to the frozen creek. And standing in the small clearing, persistently nudging the snow with a determined hoof to reach the dormant grass beneath, was a horse. This was not the crippled skeleton Crow had observed from the road weeks prior. This animal, though thin, stood firmly on 4 sound legs. Its coat was matted but dry, yet it was the horse's adornment that caused Sheriff Weiler to halt abruptly. Draped over the horse's back and secured around its chest with twine was a jacket. It was an old military field jacket, olive drab green, its color faded by decades of sun and wear. On the right breast pocket, a worn black name tape read Mercer. On the shoulder, the patch of the 1st Cavalry Division was barely discernible. "That's an army field jacket," Weiler murmured, a peculiar tightness constricting his throat. He had foregone his own coat for the horse. Crow stared, his mouth slightly agape. That beast should be dead. It should have frozen solid. Just then, the heavy wooden door of the root cellar creaked open. Caleb Mercer emerged. He appeared disheveled. His face was covered in a thick gray stubble, and dark circles bruised the skin beneath his eyes. He wore his old brown leather jacket, left open to reveal a red and navy plaid flannel shirt underneath, layers that seemed woefully insufficient against the cold. He held a battered tin cup in his gloved hands, from which steam curled upwards in wisps. At his heel, moving with a stiff but disciplined gait, was Ranger. The gray and white German shepherd stepped into the snow, positioning itself between Caleb and the intruders, and emitted a single low woof. It was not a threat, but a notification. The perimeter had been breached. Caleb took a sip from his cup, his gray eyes meeting Crow's. He displayed no surprise, nor relief at being rescued. He merely looked irritated. Quote 1. Caleb said, his voice raspy but steady. Quote 2. Harlan Crow looked as if he had encountered a specter. He took a step forward, his expensive boots sinking into the snow. Quote 3. Crow stammered. Quote 4. Caleb replied calmly. Quote 5. Crow's face flushed crimson, a mixture of the cold and his humiliation. The temperature dropped to 30 below, Mercer. You're living in a hole in the ground. This is insanity. You cannot survive here. Caleb gestured toward the horse, which had lifted its head to observe the newcomers. Phoenix stood tall, its breath steaming, exuding strength and defiance. "We seem to be doing just fine," Caleb stated. "The coffee is hot, the horse is fed, the roof held." Sheriff Weiler stepped past Crow. He walked slowly towards Caleb, his gaze moving from the shoveled path to the patched cracks in the cellar walls, and finally to the jacket draped over the horse. He noted the mud chinking, sealing the drafts. He observed the canvas tarp rigged as an airlock. He recognized the work of a combat engineer who had transformed a subterranean dwelling into a bunker. Weiler stopped 5 feet from Caleb. He looked at the name tape on the jacket covering the horse. "First Cav?" Weiler inquired quietly. "Vietnam, 1971, Caleb responded, taking another sip of coffee. Weiler nodded slowly. He glanced down at Ranger. "And the dog handler, Iraq and Afghanistan. He's retired." Weiler looked back at Caleb, the sheriff's expression softening, the professional facade momentarily lifting to reveal the respect of one soldier for another. He perceived what Crow could not. He saw the discipline. He saw the sacrifice embodied in the jacket. He saw a man who refused to abandon either man or horse. "I thought we were coming to recover a body, Mr. Mercer," Weiler stated. "I'm glad to see I was mistaken." Crow pushed forward, attempting to reassert his arrogance. "Tom, look at this. This is squalor. The county can condemn this. We can declare him mentally unfit. He's endangering himself and these animals. I can have a trailer here in an hour to take the horse." Quote, "The horse stays. Quote 1. He is under my care. and unless you have a warrant, Harlan, you are trespassing on private property. Quote 2. Tom, tell him. Quote 3. He looks fit to me, Harlan. Quote 4. The animals are alive. He has shelter, heat, and water. There's no law against living hard as long as you are living. But, Crow sputtered. Mr. Mercer is correct, Weiler continued, his voice firm. This is private property. And judging by the way that horse is looking at you, I don't think you are welcome here. Quote. Fine. Quote. Nine. Freeze to death. Starve. See if I care. But when you're ready to crawl out of that hole, don't come knocking on my door. Quote. 10. I wouldn't dream of it, Caleb replied, raising his cup in a mock toast. Crow turned and stormed back to his truck, his retreat awkward in the deep snow. He slammed the door and started the engine, reversing aggressively down the drive. Sheriff Weiler lingered. He regarded Caleb one last time. Do you require anything? Weiler inquired. I have some MREs in the back of the SUV. Perhaps some extra blankets. We're good, Sheriff. Quote, 14. But thank you. Quote, 15. That's a fine jacket, Weiler commented. Fits him well. He earned it, Caleb replied softly, his hand resting on Ranger's head. Weiler raised his hand to the brim of his hat in a slow, deliberate salute. It was not a gesture of authority, but of recognition. One survivor acknowledging another. Stay warm, Mercer, Weiler said. He turned and walked back to his vehicle. Caleb watched him depart. He waited until the SUV had vanished down the lane, and the sound of the engines had faded into the silence of the winter morning. Only then did Caleb exhale a long breath. He looked down at Ranger. They're gone, buddy. Quote 20. We triumphed. Quote 21. Against the storm, the vulture, we overcame them all. He surveyed the valley below. The snow lay deep, presaging a harsh period of labor. Yet smoke curled from his chimney, and his small fortress's flag fluttered proudly against the azure sky. He took a final swallow of his now cold coffee, finding it more satisfying than any champagne imaginable. Caleb Mercer turned and re-entered his cellar, shutting the door against the chill, leaving the outside world to ponder the resurgence of life from apparent death. The transformation did not occur instantaneously, but its eventual arrival felt akin to the earth releasing a prolonged, held exhalation. The severe grip of the Montana winter relinquished its hold. For months, the unwavering white stillness that had enveloped the Shadow Creek Valley began to recede, giving way to the Chinook winds sweeping down from the Rockies. The air, once so frigid it threatened to freeze the lungs, softened, carrying the scent of moist earth and awakening pine. The valley's soundscape shifted. The fierce gales were supplanted by the melodic drip of melting snow, forming myriad tiny rivulets coursing down the slopes to replenish the creek, which now swelled and surged with renewed vitality. Caleb Mercer stood near the perimeter of the lower pasture, resting on a shovel. He wiped perspiration from his brow with the back of his gloved hand. He was clad in a flannel shirt with rolled-up sleeves, his heavy leather jacket discarded on a nearby fence post. The sun's warmth on his skin felt almost alien after so many months of darkness. He gazed across the field. The mud was deep, but pushing through the sodden brown earth were vivid green shoots, and across this verdant expanse galloped Phoenix. The Mustang moved with exuberant, untamed energy. He bucked, kicking his hindquarters towards the sky, his mane flying in the breeze. His stride lacked any hesitation. The awkward gait of the elf shoes was gone, replaced by the fluid grace of a wild creature rediscovered. His hooves, meticulously trimmed and balanced through months of patient effort, struck the ground with a firm, consistent rhythm. Observing him, Caleb experienced a constriction in his chest unrelated to sorrow. It was pride. "Come on, Ranger," Caleb said, retrieving his jacket. "We have an errand to conduct." Ranger trotted over from where he had been investigating a badger hole. The winter had been taxing on the old dog's joints, but the spring warmth seemed to have revitalized him. He moved with an energetic bounce, his tail wagging with a low, steady sweep. They entered the old Ford truck. It started on the first try, credited to the new battery Caleb had installed using funds from selling firewood to neighbors, who, once the snow cleared, had sought out the miraculous root cellar. The drive to town felt different this time. The road was clear, the trees were budding, and Caleb Mercer was no longer an unknown traveler. Villagers waved as he passed. He returned their greetings. He pulled up to Novak's pawn and gun shop. The display window appeared less cluttered, tidied for the spring season. Caleb entered, the bell above the door chiming. Novak was behind the counter, meticulously polishing a silver flute. He looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I had a feeling you'd show up," Novak remarked. Caleb reached into his pocket, producing a thick envelope. It contained cash, composed mostly of small bills, proceeds from selling organic fertilizer gathered from the barn, 3 dozen eggs from the wild chickens now laying abundantly, and payment for repairing Mrs. Gable's tractor down the road. "I'm here to reclaim my timepiece," Caleb stated, placing the money on the counter. Novak did not count it. He reached beneath the counter, retrieving a small velvet pouch. He presented the Hamilton Field watch, resting it on the glass counter. It had been cleaned. The crystal was polished, and the worn canvas strap had been replaced with a robust new leather band. "I kept it secure," Novak said softly. "I had a few offers on it. Collectors are keen on war memorabilia. I informed them it was already designated." Caleb picked up the watch. He fastened it onto his wrist, securing the buckle. Its familiar weight rested against his skin, a comforting presence he had missed more than anticipated. He observed the dial. The second hand swept smoothly around the face, marking the progression of a new minute. "Thank you," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. Novak nodded. "You earned it, soldier." By the time Caleb returned to the ranch, the sun was beginning its descent, imbuing the sky with shades of violet and burnt orange. He guided the truck to the main gate. The old sign, which had hung askew on a single hinge, bearing the inscription, "Mercer Homestead," was gone. It had succumbed to the blizzard, buried beneath the snow until the thaw revealed its rotted wood. Caleb exited the truck. In the truck bed lay a slab of polished cedar he had carved during the long winter evenings by the stove. He retrieved his toolbox and a ladder. Ranger sat at the base of the gatepost, observing as Caleb ascended. He positioned the new sign, driving the lag bolts deep into the wood with firm, powerful turns of the wrench. Upon completion, he climbed down and stepped back to admire his handiwork. The wood gleamed in the fading sunset light. Deeply etched into the grain were the words, "Phoenix Ranch, a sanctuary for the forgotten." It was no longer merely the Mercer property. That name was associated with a history of loss and devastation. This was something new. It was a place named after the horse that had refused to perish and the mythical bird that ascended from the cinders. As Caleb packed his tools, a car slowed on the road. It was a dusty sedan with out-of-state plates. The driver, a man roughly Caleb's age, rolled down the window. He wore a faded baseball cap adorned with a veteran's insignia. "Excuse me," the man called out, his voice hesitant. "I heard in town—" "Is this the place? The place that takes in strays?" Caleb regarded the man. He perceived the weary lines etched around his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands. He saw a man seeking a place to rest his burdens. Caleb smiled. It was the first unshadowed smile he had offered in 30 years. "Yes, sir," Caleb responded. "This is the place. Drive on in. The coffee's hot." He watched the car proceed up the lane toward the newly repaired barn. This was his mission now. The ranch would not become a cattle empire, unlike Crow's. It would serve as a waypoint, a refuge where old dogs, injured horses, and weary men could regain their footing. Caleb walked up the driveway, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached the porch of the small cabin he had begun to reconstruct from the ruins of the main house. It was modest for now, comprising a single room and a sturdy roof. but it was home. He sat on the wooden steps, a slight groan escaping as his back settled. Ranger climbed up beside him, circling before settling down with a contented sigh. The dog rested his heavy head on Caleb's knee. Across the yard, the chickens scratched industriously in the dirt. The stray cat, now sleek and well-fed, basked on a fence post. Phoenix grazed near the creek, his silhouette outlined against the illuminated mountains. Caleb placed his hand on Ranger's head, his fingers sinking into the soft gray fur. He glanced at his watch. The time read 1900 hours. The day was concluding. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the key to the old ammo can. He had no need to open the box to know his father's sentiment. Jeremiah would have been proud, not because Caleb had preserved the land, but because Caleb had saved himself. The guilt that had plagued him for decades had vanished, washed away by the winter snows. He had served his penance. He had maintained his vigil through the cold and the darkness, and he had brought his squad home safely. "We made it, Ranger," Caleb whispered into the tranquil evening. Ranger looked up, his amber eyes reflecting absolute devotion. He licked Caleb's hand, a warm, rough affirmation of their bond. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars began to dot the velvet sky. But Caleb Mercer did not feel the cold. He sat on his porch, surrounded by the family he had assembled from the remnants. And for the first time in his life, he felt utterly complete. The war was over. The peace had commenced. Caleb Mercer's journey serves as a reminder that no life is truly irreparable. And frequently, the sole path to mending our internal wounds is by becoming a haven for those most in need of us. It stands as a testament that loyalty, patience, and affection are the sole forces potent enough to endure the most severe winters. If the story of Phoenix and Ranger touched your heart today, please honor their spirit by liking this video and subscribing to our channel to become part of our community. Share this optimistic message with someone you care about. And to discover another unforgettable tale of resilience, simply click on the video now appearing on your screen.